The sound that broke it wasn't loud. It was that soft metallic click of a mailbox that didn't belong to her. I was halfway through my coffee when the notification hit my phone. A quiet buzz against the kitchen counter, but the air shifted instantly, like something had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. And when I tapped the camera feed open, there she was again. Linda Whitmore, standing in front of my mailbox like she owned the street, her manicured hand slipping inside, slow and deliberate. Like this was routine, like this was hers. The morning sun caught the polished chrome of the box, reflecting her face back at her while she pulled out a stack of envelopes that weren't addressed to her, and I could almost hear the faint scrape of paper against metal through the screen, that dry, unmistakable sound of something being taken. I didn't move right away, just stood there barefoot on cold tile, coffee cooling in my hand, watching her flip through my mail with that same tight smile she always wore at HOA meetings. The one that said rules only mattered when she enforced them. This wasn't the first time, third, maybe fourth, but this time was different, and she had no idea why. The envelope she paused on was thicker than the rest, stamped with a clean federal seal, tracking barcode printed sharp and black across the front, the kind of mail that doesn't get mixed up, the kind that doesn't belong in anyone else's hands for even a second. And she hesitated just long enough for me to know she noticed it too before sliding it under her arm like it was nothing. I set my mug down slowly, the ceramic tapping the counter louder than it should have, and exhaled through my nose, tasting that bitter edge of overbrewed coffee and something else. Anticipation. My name is Ethan Carter, and before I moved into this neat little HOA neighborhood with identical lawns and perfectly spaced mailboxes, I spent years working in federal logistics systems. The kind where every package, every letter, every scan leaves a trail you don't get to erase. And standing there watching Linda walk back across her driveway with my mail tucked against her designer blouse, I knew exactly what kind of mistake she'd just made. She'd always treated this block like her personal jurisdiction, driving that white SUV at 5 miles an hour like she was patrolling something important, stopping people mid-conversation to remind them about mailbox height regulations or trash can placement. Her voice smooth, but sharp enough to cut through patience. And every time someone pushed back, she'd lean in just a little closer, like proximity was power. I tried talking to her once. After the second time I noticed missing envelopes, and she'd tilted her head, smiled that same smile, and said, "Sometimes the mail gets confused, Ethan. That's why I keep an eye on things." Like she was doing me a favor. I remember the faint scent of her perfume hanging in the air after she walked away. Something floral layered over something chemical, and the way my jaw tightened because I knew she wasn't confused. She was testing boundaries. But this morning, as I watched her front door close behind her and the street fell back into that artificial suburban quiet, something settled in me, calm and precise, like flipping a switch. I didn't grab my keys, didn't step outside, didn't shout her name across the driveway like she probably expected. Instead, I walked back to the counter, picked up my phone again, and replayed the clip, watching that moment where her fingers closed around that federal marked envelope. Because some mistakes don't need confrontation, they just need the right call. And what Linda Whitmore didn't know, standing there in her perfectly maintained neighborhood, was that this had already stopped being HOA business the second she touched my mail. The house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, more like the kind that hums underneath your skin when something is out of place. And I stood there for a moment staring at the paused frame on my phone. Linda frozen mid-reach, her fingers curled around something that was never hers, and I could still hear that faint metallic click echoing in my head like it had weight to it. I set the phone down and walked to the window, pushing the blinds just enough to see across the street. Her driveway already empty, garage door sealed. Like nothing had happened, like she had not just crossed into something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. And for a second I almost laughed because the absurdity of it all was so clean, so predictable. It felt scripted. The air inside my house carried that stale morning smell of coffee and paper, and I ran a hand along the edge of the counter, grounding myself in something solid while my mind started lining things up, step by step, the way it used to when timing mattered. People like Linda relied on hesitation, on the idea that no one would escalate beyond a complaint or a polite conversation. And that was exactly where she had miscalculated. I walked over to my desk, pulled open the top drawer, and took out a thin folder I had started building without really thinking about it at first, a few printed screenshots, timestamps, notes written in a steady hand, each one a small piece of something that now had shape, and I flipped through them slowly, feeling the texture of the paper against my fingers, each page carrying its own quiet confirmation that this was not an accident. This was a pattern. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake. The second time I told myself it was a coincidence. But by the third, I stopped telling myself anything and just started documenting. Because systems do not respond to emotions, they respond to records. I picked up my phone again and opened the camera app, scrubbing through the footage frame by frame, watching the exact moment her hand disappeared into the box, the slight shift in her posture when she realized what she had found, the way she looked over her shoulder even though the street was empty, and that tiny pause right before she walked away, like some part of her understood this was different but thing to ignore it anyway. I zoomed in on the envelope, the barcode crisp even through the grain of the camera, the federal marking unmistakable, and I felt that same calm settled in deeper, heavier, like gravity pulling everything into place. This was not about getting my mail back anymore, and it was not about proving a point to someone who thought rules bent around her. This was about triggering something. That did not bend at all. I stepped away from the window and moved back to the kitchen, picking up my mug and taking a slow sip, the coffee now lukewarm and bitter, but it did not matter because the taste only sharpened my focus, and I set it down with deliberate care before unlocking my phone and scrolling to a contact most people never need to think about. My thumb hovered there for a second, not because I was unsure, but because I knew exactly what would follow once that call connected, the chain reaction that does not ask permission or wait for explanations. And I could almost picture it already, the way things shift when authority shows up without warning. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, tires humming against smooth pavement, and everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, a neighborhood that claimed nothing ever happened beneath the surface. But inside my house, the decision had already been made, clean and final. And as I pressed the screen and lifted the phone to my ear, I realized that for the first time since I moved here, Linda Whitmore was about to find out what it felt like to lose control of something she never actually owned. I did not raise my voice when the call connected, because this was not the kind of situation that needed emotion. It needed clarity, and the woman on the other end answered with a tone that felt practiced and precise, the kind of voice that had heard every version of a complaint before, but knew how to separate noise from something real. I gave my name, my address, and then I described exactly what had happened without adding anything unnecessary, no exaggeration, no frustration, just facts laid out in the order they occurred, timestamps, repeated incidents, and the most recent event involving a federally marked envelope that had been removed from my mailbox without authorization. And there was a pause on the line, not long, but long enough to register, like a switch had flipped somewhere far beyond this quiet neighborhood. She asked me to confirm if I had documentation, and I told her I did, video recordings, still frames, and a log of dates that showed this was not a one-time mistake, and I could almost hear the shift in her breathing as she typed. Keys clicking faintly through the receiver, each tap sounding more deliberate than the last. "Do not approach the individual," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that most people would not recognize. "And do not attempt to retrieve the item yourself." And I acknowledged even though she could not see me, because I already understood what that meant. This was no longer something handled with a conversation across a driveway or a note left on a door. This had moved into a system that did not operate on personal dynamics or neighborhood authority. It operated on jurisdiction. I ended the call with a simple confirmation and set the phone down on the counter, the screen going dark as the house settled back into silence. But it felt different now, like the air itself had shifted, heavier, more focused, and I walked back to the window, pulling the blinds just enough to look out again. The sunlight now higher, casting sharper shadows across the street. Everything still perfectly arranged, perfectly calm, like nothing was about to happen. Across the way, Linda's house looked exactly the same as it always did. Clean lines, trimmed hedges, a small decorative flag near the porch that fluttered slightly in the breeze. And if someone drove by right now, they would see nothing out of place. Just another well-maintained home in a well-managed community. But I knew better, because systems like the one I had just contacted do not announce themselves. They do not send warnings, and they do not operate on anyone else's schedule. I replayed the footage one more time in my head. That moment her hand disappeared into the mailbox, the subtle confidence in the way she moved, like she had done this enough times to believe it was normal. And I realized that confidence was the only reason this had gone as far as it did, because people who think they are untouchable stop looking over their shoulder. A car door slammed somewhere down the block, sharp and hollow, followed by the low hum of an engine starting, and I stepped back from the window, letting the blinds fall closed, not because I needed to hide, but because there was nothing left to watch for, not from my side. Everything that needed to be set in motion already was, and it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was just a quiet sequence of events moving forward with absolute certainty. I picked up my mug again, now completely cold, and took a sip anyway, the bitterness stronger this time, but steady, grounding, and I set it down with the same care as before, knowing that somewhere beyond this street, beyond this HOA, beyond anything Linda thought she controlled, the kind of attention she had just triggered was already on her way, and when it arrived, it would not ask for permission, it would simply show up. Time stretched in a strange way after that call, not slow enough to feel like waiting, not fast enough to feel like anything was happening, just a steady, quiet movement forward that you could not see but you could feel if you paid attention, and I found myself moving through the house with that same controlled rhythm, checking the camera feed again, not because I expected something new, but because details mattered, every second, every angle, every frame a piece that would not need explanation. Later, outside, the neighborhood kept performing its routine, sprinklers clicking on in perfect intervals, a delivery truck rolling past at exactly the same time it did every weekday. The driver not even glancing at the row of identical mailboxes that lined the curb like props in a carefully staged set. And for a moment, it almost felt surreal how normal everything looked compared to what had already been set in motion beneath it. Across the street, Linda's garage door lifted with a smooth, mechanical hum, and her white SUV backed out slowly, precisely as always, stopping at the end of her driveway for a second longer than necessary, like she was checking something, maybe the street, maybe her own reflection in the rearview mirror, and then she drove off at that controlled same pace, 5 miles per hour through a zone that did not need controlling, disappearing around the corner like nothing had changed. I watched until she was gone, then stepped back, letting the blinds fall shut. Again, the soft slap of plastic against the window frame sounding louder in the stillness of the room. This was the part most people get wrong. They expect something immediate, a confrontation, a knock on the door, a dramatic moment where everything comes to a head, but systems like the one I had contacted do not operate on emotion or urgency. They operate on sequence, verification, coordination, and when they move with purpose, not noise. I walked to the table and spread out the printed screenshots, aligning them carefully, timestamp under timestamp, each one telling the same story from a slightly different angle, and I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling the slight curl of paper that had been handled too many times already, grounding myself in the physical reality of it, because once something leaves your hands and enters a system like this, it becomes something else entirely. A faint breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying the distant smell of freshly cut grass mixed with asphalt warming under the sun, a combination that usually meant an ordinary day in a place like this. But today it felt like a backdrop, like something waiting for a scene to play out. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no new notifications, just the same quiet screen reflecting back at me, and I slipped it into my pocket, knowing that when it did ring again, it would not be casual, it would be deliberate. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, sharp and quick, then silence again. The kind of silence that makes small sounds stand out more than they should, and I realized that I was not tense, not anxious, just focused, like waiting for a signal you already know is coming. I stepped outside onto the driveway, the concrete warm under my shoes, and looked down the street one more time. The line of mailboxes standing in perfect order, including mine, closed now, empty, but not forgotten, and I let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, because there was nothing left for me to do out here. Whatever came next would not come from this side of the street, and as I turned back toward the house, I knew that somewhere, not far enough to matter, the process had already begun. Quiet, precise, and completely out of Linda Whitmore's control. By late afternoon, The light had shifted into that golden angle that made everything look softer than it really was. Shadows stretching long across the street, while the heat from the pavement rose in slow waves you could almost see if you stared long enough. And I found myself standing near the window again, not watching for anything specific, just aware that the timing had moved past the point of possibility and into inevitability. The neighborhood carried on like it always did, a couple of kids riding bikes in uneven circles near the corner, their laughter cutting through the stillness in short bursts. A lawnmower humming somewhere 2 houses down, steady and mechanical, the kind of sound that fills space without demanding attention. And for a moment, it almost felt like I was the only one aware that something had already changed beneath all of it. I checked my phone again, not expecting a message but measuring the silence. Because silence in this context was not empty, it was active. It meant processes were running without interruption, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. A car turned into the street, tires crunching lightly over the edge of the curb before straightening out, and I watched it pass without slowing. Just another normal movement in a place built on routine, and then a few minutes later, Linda's SUV reappeared at the far end of the block, gliding back into view with that same controlled pace, sunlight flashing briefly across the windshield. As she approached her driveway, she pulled in, paused for a second, then the garage door lifted again with that same smooth hum, swallowing the vehicle inside, sealing it away like the rest of her carefully managed life. And I could almost picture her inside, setting things down, maybe sorting through whatever she had taken, still operating under the assumption that nothing beyond this street applied to her. I stepped away from the window and walked into the kitchen, the air inside cooler now, carrying a faint trace of the morning coffee and something metallic from the sink, and I leaned against the counter, listening to the subtle sounds of the house settling, the quiet creak of wood adjusting to temperature, the distant ticking of a clock that suddenly felt louder than it should. Time kept moving, steady and unbothered, and with each passing minute, the gap between action and consequence narrowed, not visibly, not dramatically, just precisely. I picked up my phone again, scrolling briefly through the footage one more time, not because I needed confirmation, but because repetition builds certainty, and every frame still held the same clarity, the same undeniable sequence of events. And I knew that somewhere, someone else had already seen this or would soon. Someone trained to interpret it without bias or assumption. Outside, the breeze picked up slightly, rustling leaves along the sidewalk, a soft, continuous sound that blended into the background like everything else, and I stepped out onto the driveway again. The concrete still warm but beginning to lose its edge as the day leaned toward evening, and I looked across the street one more time, at the house that still looked untouched, still perfectly in place, still unaware. There was no tension in me now, no anticipation in the usual sense, just a quiet understanding that the next movement would not come from me, and it would not ask for acknowledgement when it did. It would simply arrive, exact and measured. And as I stood there with the fading light stretching across the row of identical mailboxes, I realized that for the first time since this started, the outcome was no longer something I had to think about, because it was already on its way, moving closer with every passing second, whether anyone on this street realized it or not. The first sign was not a siren, not a knock, not anything dramatic, just the low, almost unnoticeable hum of an engine that did not match the rhythm of the street. And I heard it before I saw it, standing in my kitchen as the light outside dipped into that early evening blue, the kind of light that flatters everything into silhouettes and reflections. I moved toward the window slowly, not rushing, because there was no need to rush anymore. And when I pulled the blinds just enough to see through, I caught the edge of a dark vehicle easing into the street, not speeding, not hesitating, just moving with a kind of purpose that does not need explanation. It did not look like anything special at first glance, no flashing lights, no markings that stood out from a distance, just a clean, dark exterior that blended into the quiet order of the neighborhood. But there was something about the way it stopped, precise and final, directly across from Linda's house, that made it clear this was not a coincidence. The engine cut off, and for a second everything went completely still, like the entire block had taken a breath without realizing it. And then the doors opened. Not slammed, not rushed, just opened with a controlled motion that matched everything else about the scene. 2 figures stepped out, both dressed in plain, Professional clothing that did not need to announce authority to carry it. Their posture straight, movements measured, and even from where I stood, I could see the small details that most people would miss. The badges clipped at the waist, the folders in hand, the kind of quiet preparation that comes before something official begins. I felt that same calm settle in deeper, not satisfaction, not relief, just confirmation, because this was exactly how it was supposed to happen. Not loud, not chaotic, just precise. They crossed the street without looking around, not scanning for approval, not acknowledging anything beyond their objective. And as they reached Linda's front walkway, the porch light flickered on automatically, casting a warm glow that made the scene look almost ordinary, like any other evening visit. Except there was nothing ordinary about who was standing at that door. One of them adjusted the folder slightly, the paper edges catching the light for a split second, and then there was a knock, firm but not aggressive, the kind of knock that carries weight without needing force. Inside, there was a pause, a brief delay that stretched just enough to be noticeable, and I imagined her hearing it, maybe glancing at the door, maybe assuming it was a neighbor or a delivery, still operating under the same assumptions she had all day. The door opened slowly, and from my angle, I could only see part of her, the familiar outline, the same posture she used when she spoke to people from a position she believed she controlled. But that posture shifted almost immediately, subtle but real, as the first words were exchanged. I could not hear what was said, but I did not need to, because the change was visible, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hand tightened against the doorframe. And then one of the agents held up something small, something official, and even from a distance, I knew exactly what it was. Time did not speed up or slow down. It just continued forward, steady and certain, as the conversation moved from introduction to explanation, and I stepped back from the window, letting the blinds fall closed again, the soft sound of plastic settling into place marking the end of my part in this. Outside, the neighborhood still looked the same, still quiet, still perfectly arranged, but something fundamental had shifted, and for the first time since this started, Linda Whitmore was no longer the one deciding what happened next. The conversation at her door did not end quickly, and that alone told me everything I needed to know, because if it had been simple, if it had been something that could be explained away with a smile and a casual excuse, it would have been over in seconds, but instead it stretched, steady and deliberate, and I found myself drifting back toward the window again, drawn by that same quiet gravity that had been building all day. I lifted the blinds just enough to see, careful not to shift them too much, and the scene across the street had changed in a way that most people would not notice unless they knew what to look for. The agents still standing exactly where they had been, but Linda no longer holding the door the same way, her posture tighter now, shoulders drawn in slightly, like the space around her had narrowed without warning. One of the agents held the folder open, angled just enough for her to see, and even from this distance I could make out the structured lines of printed documents, official formatting that does not leave room for interpretation, and the other agent spoke with the kind of calm that does not need to raise its volume to carry authority, the kind that fills the space without effort. Linda said once, then again, slower the second time, her hand moving briefly as if to gesture or explain something. But the motion stopped halfway, like she realized it would not change anything. The evening air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and distant pavement, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting a soft amber glow that turned everything into a series of clean, defined shapes. Her figure framed in the doorway, the agent standing just outside the threshold, the dark vehicle still parked with quiet certainty. I watched as one of them extended a hand, not demanding, not forceful, just expecting, and there was a moment, brief but clear, where Linda hesitated, her eyes shifting, her weight moving from one foot to the other, and then she stepped back inside, disappearing from view for a few seconds that felt longer than they should have. When she returned, she was holding something, a small stack of envelopes, and even from across the street, even through the dimming light, I knew exactly what they were, the edges catching just enough glow to make them stand out against everything else. She handed them over one by one, slower than necessary, like each movement carried more weight than the last, and the agent received them without comment, placing them neatly into the folder, each piece becoming part of something larger, something that no longer belonged to this street or this HOA or anything she thought she controlled. There was no argument, no raised voices, no scene that would draw neighbors out onto their porches, just a quiet transfer of reality from one set of hands to another. And that was what made it final. I stepped back from the window again, letting the blinds fall into place. The soft click of plastic settling against the frame, sounding almost identical to the one that had started. All of this, but now it carried a different meaning, not intrusion, but closure. Inside my house, everything was still, the same faint ticking of the clock, the same steady air, but the tension that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by something more solid, more complete. I walked to the counter and rested my hand against the surface, feeling the coolness of it under my palm, grounding myself in the present moment, because this was the point where everything shifted from possibility into record, from assumption into documented fact, and there was no undoing that. Outside, the conversation continued for a few more minutes, measured and controlled, and then I heard the car doors close again, that same precise sound as before, followed by the low hum of the engine starting, and I did not need to look to know that they were leaving with more than they had arrived with, carrying with them the exact weight of what had happened. While across the street, for the first time since I moved in, Linda Whitmore was standing in her own doorway, without control over how the story ended. The engine noise faded down the street until it blended into the background of everything else, just another passing sound in a neighborhood built on routine. But the silence it left behind felt different, heavier, like something had been removed that was not supposed to be there in the first place, and I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a moment, listening to that silence settle into the walls, into the floor, into the quiet ticking of the clock that suddenly felt sharper, more defined. I moved back toward the window again, slower this time, not out of urgency, but out of habit, and when I lifted the blinds, the street looked exactly the same as it always did, streetlights casting their steady glow, driveways empty or filled with the same familiar vehicles, nothing out of place to anyone who had not been watching closely. But across the street, Linda was still standing in her doorway, and that was the difference. Not what had changed physically, but what had shifted in presence. She did not move the way she usually did, no quick adjustments, no controlled gestures, just stillness, like she was recalculating something that no longer added up. And even from this distance, I could see it in the way her shoulders sat lower than before, the way her hand rested against the doorframe without that usual tension of control. The porch light above her cast a soft halo that made the scene look almost staged, like something out of place in its own environment. And for a second, I wondered what was going through her mind, not out of sympathy, but out of understanding how quickly certainty can collapse when it meets something immovable. Eventually, she stepped back inside, and the door closed with a quiet finality, the click echoing faintly across the still air, and that sound, simple as it was, marked the end of something that had been building for days, maybe longer. I let the blinds fall closed again and turned away, the room behind me unchanged, the same counter, the same coffee mug now empty, the same faint smell of paper and cooled air, but the atmosphere had shifted into something calm, more grounded, like the tension had drained out through a channel I could not see but knew was there. I walked over to the table where the printed screenshots were still laid out, each one a frozen moment that had already served its purpose, and I gathered them slowly, stacking them into a neat pile, feeling the edges align under my fingers, the paper smoothing out as it came together, and I slid them back into the folder without rushing, because there was no need to hold on to them the same way anymore. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, leaves rustling in a low, continuous sound that filled the gaps left by everything else, and I stepped out onto the driveway one last time. The night air cooler now, carrying that faint mix of grass and pavement that defined this place, and I looked down the street, at the row of identical mailboxes, each one closed, each one quiet, including mine. For the first time since this started, it felt like it belonged exactly where it was supposed to, untouched, undisturbed, part of a system that did not rely on anyone's opinion to function. I took a slow breath, steady and even, and let it out just as slowly, because there was nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to prepare for, just the quiet continuation of a process that had already reached its turning point. And as I turned back toward the house, I knew that whatever came next would not need to be watched, It would simply happen, documented somewhere far beyond this street, beyond this HOA, beyond anything Linda Whitmore ever thought she could control. Morning came quieter than usual, not because the neighborhood had changed, but because something underneath it had settled into place, and I noticed it the moment I stepped outside. The air cooler, cleaner somehow, carrying that faint scent of damp grass and early sunlight warming the pavement, the kind of morning that usually felt routine, but today carried a different weight. I walked down the driveway slowly, my eyes drifting toward the row of mailboxes without urgency, just habit, and when I reached mine, I paused for a second, hand resting lightly against the cool metal, feeling its stillness before opening it. Inside, there was a single envelope, placed neatly, untouched, exactly where it was supposed to be, the tracking barcode clean and intact, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, not because I doubted the outcome, but because seeing it complete the sequence made everything final in a way nothing else could. I took the envelope out, the paper firm, between my fingers, and closed the mailbox with a soft click, that same sound that had started everything now carrying a completely different meaning. Not intrusion, not violation, just order restored. Across the street, Linda's house looked the same as always, blinds drawn a little tighter than usual, no movement in the driveway, no sign of the routine she had maintained so carefully before, and I did not need to see inside to understand what had shifted, because absence can be just as loud as presence when you know what to listen for. A car passed at the end of the block, slow and steady, the driver barely glancing in my direction, and I realized that for everyone else, this was just another morning, another day in a neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. And maybe that was the point, because the things that matter most do not always announce themselves. They just correct what is out of place and move on. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the slight texture of the paper, the weight of something that had traveled through a system designed to protect it. And for a moment, I thought about how easily it could have been dismissed, how easily I could have let it go after the first or second time, written it off as inconvenience instead of violation. But systems only work when someone decides they matter enough to use them. I walked back toward the house, the concrete cool under my shoes now, the sunlight stretching longer across the driveway. And as I reached the door, I paused. Once more, glancing back at the street, at the perfect alignment of houses and mailboxes and trimmed lawns, everything appearing exactly as it should, and yet fundamentally different in a way no one could see unless they had been paying attention. Inside, I placed the envelope on the counter and stood there for a second, letting the quiet settle around me again. The same ticking clock, the same still air, but without the tension that had filled it before, and I realized that this was what resolution actually felt like. Not loud, not dramatic, just complete. Followed whatever for Linda would happen beyond this street, beyond my involvement, handled by people and processes that did not need my attention anymore. And that was the point, because control had never been hers to begin with. It had only seemed that way until something stronger, something structured, stepped in and corrected the balance. I picked up the envelope one last time, feeling its weight settle naturally in my hand, and allowed myself a small, steady exhale, because the truth was simple and final, the kind that does not need to be repeated or explained, just understood in silence. That power does not belong to the loudest voice on the street. It belongs to the system that does not need to raise its voice at all.